Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and today I'm speaking with Marietje Schaake, author of the book The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. Mariette, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on a podcast, and I know I mispronounced your name at least once. So, for the benefit of our listeners, please, could you give us your name again, please?
Sure. I'm from the Netherlands, and it's incredibly hard for anyone non-Dutch to pronounce, but the English speakers usually say Marietje Schaake.
I do apologize for that. Well, I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
I'm from the Netherlands. I work at Stanford University, and I look at the intersection of technology and democracy. And that usually means looking at new policy proposals or suggesting what they might look like, teaching students, because who knows, I may have the next Mark Zuckerberg in my class at Stanford. So I'm very driven by protecting the public interest and understanding what the proper place of technology in our open societies should be.
This is something that, but you bring this definitely to the book, but you also bring to this book as well a background in public policy, and those two interests are definitely intertwined throughout the book. What led you to write a book about the impact of tech upon democracy?
Well, I've been a lawmaker myself. For 10 years, I served in the European Parliament, and a lot of the ideas around technology have shifted dramatically in the past 15 to 20 years. Where when I started as a newly elected member in 2009, there was so much hope and excitement around what technology would bring, also for democracy. Remember, this was the time when Barack Obama had just been elected on a platform of using, data-driven campaigning and social media for grassroots engagement, and the whole world wanted what he had done. And there were expectations that putting phones in the hands of people, connecting them to social media platforms, would also help democratize people in repressive societies, so living under authoritarianism, including in the Middle East. There was a lot of excitement and hope of what technology could bring. And now, after having seen a lot of the upcoming tech companies grow into monopolists, a lot of their promises around being on the side of democracy, doing no evil, being concerned with people in society writ large have really, been pushed aside, and profit motives are incredibly important. I wanted to look at the ecosystem of tech companies, bigger ones, smaller ones, American ones, but also companies around the world, and look at them in a narrow lens of that of power and the impact on democratic governance. So who gets to decide, who knows what, where does accountability come from, and what is the whole wave, including now AI, of technologies mean for citizens and the rule of law. And because that's a larger challenge, I thought, let me write it down so that I can have a conversation starter at a different point than the latest headlines about Elon Musk or Facebook or some scandal that inevitably catches people's attention and is important, but does not allow for a deeper dive into the systemic nature of what I think the problem is, namely the power grab by commercially driven companies at the expense of our democracies.
It's one that's a really complex question, as you described, because we're not just talking about here the democratic states and big tech, but there's another element that you talk about, which are states that are not democratic, which one of the things that stood out for me in your book is how in some ways they seem to be more effectively adjusting and adapting to tech in ways that are far from positive. And I'm thinking about the contrast you set up. You begin your book by talking by talking about the virtues of democracy, talking about how you quote Winston Churchill, it's basically the worst system except for all the others, and how that makes it something that's worth preserving. And yet, as you detail that, what tech does is incredibly disruptive to the point of threatening the very essence of democracy itself.
That's right. So it is a complex problem, but I did double down on making it a lively narrative with examples that appeal to everyone. So it's not technically too complex for the average news follower, and it allows for people to understand the systemic challenges that we face through everyday examples. So hopefully that will make it a book that appeals to a wider readership, because I think the problem of the outsized power of tech companies concerns everyone. And certainly, I've also contrasted different governance reactions around the world, not just in the democratic world, where I think largely politicians have abdicated their responsibility, but I've looked at countries like China, Russia, India, to understand what different choices there really are on the part of states to regulate technology, use technology, shape markets, and instrumentalize it really for their value systems. And while, of course, if I make the case for stronger democracy, the rule of law, I would not want to look to China as an example of how those can be achieved. But what we can see in China is how the Communist Party has understood that technology is not just an exciting tool, or that tech companies do not just boost the economy, but that they very much impact politics and geopolitics, matters of freedom, surveillance, control, information ecosystems. And so we see that in China, the state has very firmly asserted itself and made sure that the tech sector is more of an instrument of its political vision. And that kind of response or appreciation has been lacking in the democratic world, where essentially, led by the United States, politicians from the left and the right have believed that leaving the market to its devices would lead to the best results, not only economically, but also for society writ large. And the tech coup is a criticism of that view.
The criticism I thought was especially pointed because one of the things that comes across in your description of the engagement of politicians in democratic countries with technology is that they often do so from a position of profound ignorance. And I was thinking your description of you. I like how you integrate some of your personal experiences, the places, your participation, the engagement of it in Europe, but also how your description of, for example, congressional hearings, where you have congressmen and senators who have, in some cases, have grown up in a world of tech, and yet seem to be clueless as to some of the most fundamental questions, such as where the revenue comes from and how basic operations work. And it seems like to say that we're going to let the market figure it out is a way of saying, oh, this is just too complicated for me. I'm just gonna hope it all works out for the best. Only it's not.
Mm-hmm. Well,
go ahead.
I have a couple of different thoughts on this notion that politicians don't understand technology. First of all, we should not make the notion of expertise or knowledge a sort of precondition for being concerned about the role of technology in our societies. Typically, parliamentarians, members of Congress, representatives that are elected are generalists. While people in Congress vote about health-related laws, few of them will be doctors. Similarly, they will deal with agricultural subsidies or other kinds of legislation. Few of them will be farmers. All of that is to say, you will inevitably have a bunch of people voting on laws or proposing them that are not engineers or that do not sort of understand the technology in great detail. What is important is that we appreciate the impact that technology has and will have on the lives of people, on whether minorities are discriminated, on our national security, on the classrooms of our children, or the hospitals that we may have to use one day. So I do believe that everybody has a stake in the role of technology in our society, but of course, the understanding of technology on the part of lawmakers is often shaped to a large extent by lobbyists. And this is an unnecessary information gap that can be filled with more independent expertise, with accessible information in the public interest. And so one of the proposals that I offer as a solution in the tech coup is that, for example, where Congress has a legal service, similarly, the European Parliament has, is many elected bodies have a legal service because, again, many elected members are not lawyers, do not have legal degrees, but they do have to write laws. And so it's really great to have this independent, impartial expertise that can help inform political processes. And we need something similar for technology, which will actually make politicians smarter, have easier access to information about technology, but also makes them less dependent on whatever lobby chews up for them.
That actually gets to another aspect of the subject that you talk about, which is not just the knowledge gap, but how there almost seems to be a very conscious effort on the part of executives in the tech field, not necessarily all of them, but quite a few of them, to effectively make so much of what they do a black box, to keep their processes secret, and to maybe not necessarily consciously withhold knowledge, but definitely to monopolize it and to gain power from that monopolization. You talk, for example, this is a relatively minor part of your book, but about how one of the challenges in doing what you describe is the fact that these people who are experts are so often lured into the tech companies because the tech companies offer better salaries, offer better working conditions, and it's simply more appealing to have such a highly valued piece of knowledge. So you don't have the same pool of experts to counsel and advise legislators the way that you do, say, legislative councils filled with attorneys or advisory groups of doctors who can provide that sort of expertise to fill in those gaps.
Well, exactly. There are a couple of ways in which companies are very opaque to their own benefit. On the one hand, it is the lack of transparency into the inner workings of a number of tech products that we use every day. The trade secrecy has really become a sort of general shield, if not a wall, against a transparency into how technologies work, and that is getting in the way of the public interest and a well-informed public democratic debate, for example. But there is also very deliberate deception. Let's not kid ourselves. In the Tech Coup, I write about data centers and what it takes for companies to get the right licenses and green lights from the different political bodies, the executive, but also local governments oftentimes have to decide, do they want these big buildings full of servers, buildings the size of multiple American football fields in their territory, including with connections to the energy grid, the use of water, and so on and so forth. Now, these are very consequential decisions that oftentimes part-time city councilors will have to ultimately give a thumbs up or thumbs down over. But the companies, Google, AWS, Microsoft, what have you, that are bidding on these contracts or that are trying to get the right licenses are often hiding their true identities. So they will do so as a shell company or a shell foundation even, so that citizens don't even know who is asking for permission to build a hyperscale data center or data center in their backyards. That kind of deception, I think, is unacceptable. The same with figures about energy use. It was recently revealed that companies are really systematically underrepresenting the amount of energy that they're going to be using, the amount of water that they're going to be using, while already our power grids are under enormous pressure and communities truly suffer. There are states in the US where there's drought, where households have to ration the use of water, and at the same time these data centers are using endless amounts of gallons of water, and there's not even a standard nationally in the US or globally for that matter to measure resource uses in order to actually have a full picture of what these companies are using. So there is sort of the intransparency that comes from a clever use of intellectual property rights protections like trade secrecy, but there's also very deliberate deceptive practices on the part of companies, and we should just call it out. That is actually unacceptable behavior, if you ask me, that also has an impact on our ability to have a well-informed debate about what place these companies should have in our societies.
One of the other aspects of your book that I thought was very interesting was how you don't just describe this in very general terms. You talk about the differences in that debate in democratic societies, and the contrast you set up is with Europe and the United States. And you saw it, and I was thinking in particular of your description of the effort to establish a data center in the Netherlands and the debate that went there, and how it struck me it was a debate that took place a little differently than so many of the debates do in the United States. I mean, a lot of the premises were the same, the fundamental issues were the same, but you had a different approach to it because you're dealing with a different set of laws. And as you explained, these companies are not ignoring these laws. They are adapting to them. They're trying to use them to their best benefit, but they do recognize that basically that they are responsive to these things, which points to a more optimistic conclusion for what you're trying to achieve, that these companies are not going to fight to the death, that they're actually going to respond and adjust if they're properly pressured.
Well, yes, typically when democratic governments do decide to lay down the law, it has an effect. We recently saw this arm wrestling between Elon Musk and a justice in Brazil. The justice wanted some accounts on X to be shut down because they were investigated or accused of spreading disinformation, challenging the actual outcome of the presidential elections. And Elon Musk didn't want that. It led to a whole back and forth between the justice and Elon Musk that ultimately, despite big words that Musk used, he accepted that he would, with his company X and then also Starlink internet connections that he pulled into this fight, would have to respect the law of the land. So I agree that we have seen a lot of fights, intense lobbying, incredible amounts of money being spent, for example, in Brussels on trying to influence the regulatory agenda, the very same in DC. Companies are able to buy talent straight out of Congress when they have to deal with antitrust cases. They hire people from congressional offices that have dealt with antitrust cases. So their methods are very sophisticated. They are throwing a lot of resources at it, but ultimately, you often find, not always, but often, that companies do respect the law if they have no other choice. And this should, of course, not be the exception, right? I mean, the whole idea that tech has been under-regulated for so long at the expense of human rights, at the expense of the public interest, public health, national security, the well-being of minorities, our democratic debate, so many problems that we face because companies have just been given too much space and are not held to account. That is the exception that we should correct. We should really start treating technology and the tech companies the way we treat pharma, for example, where we say, great medication can be very, very helpful, but you don't get to live experiment on patients, right? We want to see you do that within parameters that have checks and balances, that have oversight. You may be able to try some new discoveries in the very strict confines of a clinical trial and then bring it to market, but you can't just push the latest experiments onto the market the way that AI companies are now pushing their latest models onto the market without those kinds of regulatory constraints. So essentially, I worry that we are not treating technology the way we treat the automobile industry or pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, financial services, where it's just common sense to have some independent processes that verify the claims of companies. And if we would only treat tech companies the same, we would already be in a much better position than we are now.
There's an ironic aspect of your book because near the end of it, when you're talking about AI, you illustrate how tech companies themselves appreciate this. I actually I laughed when I read your description about how it is suddenly tech companies have become apostles for regulation when they're confronting the challenge of AI, that they want your restraint on it. So they're you describe throughout the book how they have this very laissez-faire philosophy, and have made and have you know preached that historically. But now that these companies are established, and you have this sudden AI threat, which is being advanced, not the cutting edge of which is not necessarily in these large companies, but in these smaller ones. Now, all of a sudden, big tech wants regulation, wants greater control. There's some very valid reasons for that, as you've just illustrated. But there also is this sense of how, as you also note, that they want to essentially preserve their share of the market. So now they're happy to welcome a certain type of regulation.
Well, yes and no. So whenever I hear companies making any claims, I think it's always good to contrast those with what they do. So not just to listen to what they say, but also to look at what they do. And with a series of calls for regulating AI, it did sound as if a number of tech companies were going to welcome guardrails. In fact, were worried about the power of their products. But then when it came to concrete, tangible regulatory proposals like the EU AI Act, for example, or other kinds of proposals, as we've just seen in California, those same companies that said, yes, please regulate, actually started lobbying against the specific regulations. So it's normal for companies to try to shape any kind of legislative proposal to their advantage. But that means that we should not fall for sort of empty phrases like "we welcome regulation," because the devil is always in the detail. Regulation is actually a process that can lead to a gazillion different outcomes. So, we have to look at it case by case. But for anyone who's interested in the topic, I would recommend looking at what the companies and their CEOs do rather than just what they say.
You conclude your book by talking about specific solutions, and you've already alluded or mentioned some of them earlier in our interview. I was wondering if you could encapsulate what you see as the best way forward for democracies specifically. What should democracies be doing, or what can democracies do in order to manage the impact of technology upon the democratic process?
Well, first of all, democratic leaders and institutions should feel empowered to reclaim their role. They've really had too much of a hands-off approach to tech, and it's gotten out of hand. So it's time to rebalance through a combination of regulation, which is often what people point to, but I also look to what investments can do and to what governments as customers can do, because a lot of tech companies have the government in one way or another. Could be the Department of Defense, could be all the executive branches and all the software that they need as some of their main customers. So on the one hand, that creates what I think is a dangerous dependence with single points of failure throughout the ecosystem. But it also creates leverage that governments can use to their advantage by having more strict criteria in their contracts, for example, by having model contracts for local government or public institutions, so that they're in a better position to buy technologies that they need and have more accountability and transparency, for example. So a lot of the solutions that I look at are in the direction of creating more transparency, more independent understanding, and more accountability. And that goes for the tech companies, but also for the governments using them. The tech coup is a criticism of the outsized power of tech companies, but very much recognizes that this is the space that the companies have been given. They take the space that was left by democratic governments, and also sometimes abused by democratic governments. So, for example, we see law enforcement using commercial spyware to go after suspects without the proper guardrails or without transparency on the part of governments, right? They they claim that they will act in the spirit and the letter of the law, but when you look at the practice, sometimes technology has become not just an outsourcing of tasks, but also an outsourcing of accountability on the part of government. And so I want to see more transparency and accountability throughout the use of technology, whether it is those that develop them, the companies, or governments that deploy and use them.
We appreciate the time you've taken to speak with us, but before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
Yes. Well, the book tour is very exciting. A lot of people are keen to hear more and to engage. So I'm, going to universities, to different sectors. Like next week, I have a talk with a number of judges in the Netherlands who want to understand how technology impacts their role in society. So book tour is a lot of my focus these days, but I've also just been appointed this week to chair a working group on the EU level that will actually begin to implement the newly adopted AI Act. So it's called the Code of Practice, and we are going to look at what companies can do, AI companies can do, to make sure that their foundation models essentially meet the criteria of the law. So it's rather technical. It's a volunteer job, but with a great team of people. So I'm excited to do something more, public policy oriented after some time exclusively at Stanford University with a lot of teaching and research to kind of go back to that policy field for the next 6 months or so.
It sounds really exciting, especially, it's not often I get to speak with someone who has a new book out and then who immediately gets to turn around and start implementing some of the conclusions or some of their findings into policy.
Well, it's not my findings necessarily. It's the law that has been adopted by the governments of EU countries, the European Parliament, proposed by the European Commission. So we have to look at the implementation of the first comprehensive AI law adopted in the democratic world. That's very exciting. And it will also help me dive deeper into what companies can do to ensure that there is more compliance with the AI law. So to be continued. Maybe it is the inspiration for a new book. We'll see.
Well, I hope it's a book with a very happy ending. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks so much.